Hello and welcome back to this little series about camera settings for beginners. If you missed the first video about aperture, I highly recommend you go check that out. It's a good place to start when learning how to expose for your images or your videos. Today we're going to be covering the setting called shutter speed. And more specifically, today we'll be covering shutter speed for photography. Between photography and videography, it's a little bit different in how you approach shutter speed and how you use it. So yeah, today we're covering the photo side of things, and I guess the best way to start is, again, defining what shutter speed is. Essentially, your camera has a shutter. Every time you take a photo, there's a shutter mechanism that closes and opens. And the rate at which it closes and opens is what we call shutter speed. So as you may or may not know, the basic premise of photography is the capturing of light. So if we have a sensor, a camera sensor, and in front of that we have a shutter that closes and opens, when it's open, it's pretty much just recording any light that hits the sensor. So naturally, it's very time-based. So the longer your shutter is open, the more time it has to gather light, and it just accumulates and becomes brighter and brighter. And when we're looking at shutter speed, the numbers that you'll be seeing are 1 over n. So you might have 1 over 80, 1 over 125, 1 over 250, and so on and so forth. Now the inverse of that is that you might have shutter speed denoted in terms of seconds. So you might have a 4-second shutter, or a 10-second shutter, or a 30-second shutter. And this means that it's literally open for 4 seconds, 10 seconds, and 30 seconds. So the names are actually very self-explanatory. The longer your shutter is open, the brighter the image. So 1 over 25th will be brighter than 1 over 500. And I'll take a couple sample images for you just to illustrate that point. So for this first image, I'll be shooting at an aperture of f4.0 and the shutter speed 1/25th. We're taking the same image with the same settings, and the only thing I'm going to change is shutter speed to about 1/100th. So that's the first effect of shutter speed. Again, it's just a way to expose for an image, aka control how much light and how bright the image is. Now, much like aperture helps control depth of field, shutter speed also controls one more thing, and that is motion blur. And again, if we think of the camera as something that just records light and the shutter as the door that opens to allow the camera to record light, motion blur is essentially just the same thing. Whatever movement of light there is during the time period that the shutter is open will be recorded. So when we take a photo, if, for example, there's a fast moving object, clearly not me, but let's say maybe a car, a bird, or your child running. If your shutter is too slow, it's going to record that movement and you'll be kind of left with these ghosts, these trails, or it'll just look like one massive blur. And this is probably best explained just through examples. So since my main camera isn't going to be running anywhere, I'm just going to be moving this camera while I'm taking the photo just to pretend that there's movement. The final photo is a blurry mess. This is pretty erratic and a lot of movement technically, but you can imagine that if it's a car or a child running really fast, it's going to end up in a similar kind of photo. So what do? We're going to raise the shutter speed or make it faster. And let's say we shoot at maybe 1 over 250 and see what that does. So the resulting image is still blurry, but if we compare it to the first one, we can see that there's a large improvement. We're going to keep going. 1 over 500. And finally, we have a frozen image. So essentially what that means is that the shutter was fast enough to freeze the motion that was presented in front of it. If the shutter is too slow, it's going to be capturing all the motion in front of it and it's going to result in motion blur. Now, a couple side notes for motion blur. Obviously, if you have a still object like the camera in front of me where it's not moving, you can really use shutter speed to your advantage. Now you can really drop the shutter speed down because there's not going to be any movement and get a really bright image and a really clean image. But one thing you might not consider is that even if the thing you're shooting is not moving, technically we are when we're taking this photo. From simple things as, even when we're trying to stand still, you notice that your camera will move a little bit. The easiest way to illustrate this is, I don't know if you're going to do it though, but attaching a laser pointer to your lens. And then you can just see how the laser will not be still. It will always be, there's some sort of erratic movement. And that's just from the fact that, I don't know, maybe too much coffee or we're just not able to be completely still. So then naturally you might ask, Well, how are we supposed to take images of still objects if we ourselves are not still? And there's a couple ways to combat that. The easiest way is a tripod, like the one that I'm using right now for this main camera. If you do that and you lock it off, there won't be any movement. Of course, you might want to consider that the moment that you press the shutter, you might introduce some sort of shake or movement to the camera. And so for that one, you can go into the menu and set up a timer. So a lot of people will set a 2-second timer. The idea behind this is that you set it up on a tripod or a stable surface and you press the shutter. So by the time you take the photo, your hands will be away from the camera and there theoretically should be zero movement and you'll have the most stable shot. Now, other ways to combat this problem, kind of a camera shake, is something called 3 points of contact, and that just means as many points of contact on the camera at once. You might have your right hand on it, you might have your left hand cupping the lens or the body, and you might have it touching your chest. Or you might have the camera strap around your neck, have it extended, put some pressure on it, your right hand and your left hand again. Finally, there are cameras that have built-in stabilization, and that just means the camera sensor kind of anticipates your movement, and it'll move the sensor kind of opposite to that motion or with that motion, if that makes sense, to make the end result look stable. Alternatively, similar sort of stabilization systems have been in lenses for the longest time, and you'll find that the kit lens that comes with your camera often has this stabilization built in. And I briefly mentioned this in the aperture video, but when I discovered the 50mm 1.8, I was enamored with the bokeh and the depth of field and the low light capability of f1.8 that I neglected my kit lens, which had stabilization, which would have actually been very useful in a number of different situations. And what I mean by that is this is the difference of being able to shoot at, let's say, 1/15 handheld and still having a sharp image versus maybe having to shoot at 1/125 or maybe a 1/60 if you have very stable hands. But stabilization is actually very, very helpful. And one final kind of fun side note about shutter speed and motion blur is a long exposure. And essentially what that means is just setting the shutter to a very long exposure. So maybe something as short as 5 seconds or 10 seconds, 15, 30 seconds, or something called a bulb mode, which allows you to determine how long. Pretty much it just stays open for as long as you have the shutter down, and then it closes once you release. So these are called long exposures, and you might have seen these really cool photos of water flowing and it looks like just mist and it's very smooth looking. And essentially what they've done is taken a long exposure of fast moving water and recording all the motion blur that comes along with the current or the movement of water. Alternatively, you might have seen cute light painting photos back in the day of people drawing hearts or messages, writing their names out, and that's essentially all just a long shutter. During the duration of the shutter remaining open, people just move the light source around and what you get is light painting. So yeah, those are some just the fun effects that you can do with shutter speed. And essentially that wraps it up for this portion of the series. Shutter speed is, I think, one of the more self-explanatory features, and is a little bit, it varies a little bit from person to person, but just take a lot of photos, try different shutter speeds, see what works for you in terms of how low you can go. For example, I can't shoot below 1/125 just because my hands are very, very shaky. It's gotten worse. So I have certain limitations when it comes to shooting photos in terms of shutter speed. So now we've learned aperture and we have learned shutter speed. And I'll give you kind of scenarios now where those two will work in tandem. So let's say I want to take a photo of this camera. I'm going to set my aperture to the lowest that it'll go, just because this room is not very bright right now. So for this lens, wide open means f4. So at f4, I notice that the image is still a little bit dark, so I'm going to drop my shutter speed, and I'm going to try to shoot at 1/13 and really rely on the stabilization built into this lens. And hopefully, yeah, this photo still looks like it's in focus. One example I forgot to mention or discuss is the remodeled kitchen that we mentioned in the last video about aperture. And let's say that in order to get everything in focus in this kitchen, we want to shoot at f14. And we'll notice that the image is very, very, very dark. And we have no idea anything about ISO. How do we expose for this image? Where you can start is getting a cheap tripod off of Amazon or something like that. You might even have one lying around. Throw your camera on a tripod, 2-second timer, set your aperture to f14 and lower your shutter speed to maybe about a 10-second exposure or so, and take your photo. And again, that's just one way that aperture and shutter speed can work in tandem while understanding the limitations of both of these settings. And the reason we're able to drop our shutter speed to a 10-second exposure is because there is no movement in the frame. All your furniture, they're not going to start running or moving. And because we've introduced the 2-second timer, we will not have any movement, ideally, in the camera. Now, where things start to become confusing is when you have your aperture already set to the widest that it'll go and you've lowered your shutter speed, but now the image is still too dark. And that's where the next feature, ISO, comes in. The other scenario for that might be, again, we're trying to take photos of our cats or our children, and we don't want to shoot wide open at 1.8 because we want our autofocus to keep up with them. So we want more things in focus, right? But for our shutter speed, we don't want it to be below 1/250 because they're so fast. So in that case, again, we've already kind of determined, oh, with aperture, this is what I'm willing to shoot at. Shutter speed, I'm not going to go below 1/250, but my image is still dark. And that's where ISO will come in, and that's the next video. I also apparently forgot to record an ending, so this is that. Thank you so much for watching thus far, and especially thank you to the ones that have shown support on the first video. I'll be back soon with the third video of this series, ISO. And then probably planning a little bit more ahead on the next videos after that. But yeah, thank you so much for watching and hope that helped you. If you have any questions, as always, please comment down below or send me an email or something like that. And yeah, have a wonderful day. Bye.